Welcome to the fifth video on John Walton's six-part Lost World series. Walton is an Old Testament scholar specializing in ancient Near Eastern backgrounds and is a main professor of exegesis at Wheaton College. Today we will be covering the lost world of Scripture, ancient literary culture, and biblical authority. Let's get started. Walton and his co-author Brent Stanley's point in writing this book is to encourage those who are unsure of the Bible's authority and are about to leave it completely. It's also to equip Christians to discuss biblical authority with non-Christians more intellectually, and to put a concept of inerrancy on surer footing, securely founding it on a biblical worldview. This often contrasts to a modern worldview according to Walton, but they want to affirm the Bible is truthful in everything that it affirms, but that does often look different than our modern conceptions. In part 1, Walton discusses the Old Testament world of communication and composition. The Bible was produced in an oral, hearing-dominant society, and writing was for the official purposes, and there was no private publishers like there are today. Authority figures stood behind texts, and texts were used as a reference when needed. There were also updates to texts, and they remained fluid for a time. This is also seen in biblical texts like Proverbs, and Psalms, and Joshua and Deuteronomy, which have later additions to them. And we also have to understand and ask, Walton thinks, what the biblical authors and texts are trying to communicate. Is their message cosmological, theological, scientific, or historical? He suggests that a text can never mean what it never meant, and that the authority of the text is within the communicator's expressed meaning. Walton is convinced that we need new models of biblical hermeneutics that are based on the understanding of the roles of authority figures, the nature of documents, and the transmission of traditions in hearing and dominant communities. In terms of biblical authority, the authors remind us that there was either an authority figure empowered by the Spirit at the head of the books of the Bible, or some untraceable tradition. Also, the final form of the Bible was a product of scribal group or scribal groups, and it may have undergone a long process of transmission and composition. In part 2, Sandy talks about the New Testament world of composition and communication. His thesis is that we will misunderstand the New Testament if we misunderstand the oral dimensions that went into its creation and formation and transmission, like other documents of the time. Oral logic was prevalent even in written texts, and written texts were often for performance. Historians, philosophers, and rabbis all operated with orality preference. Jesus did too, and he is described very similarly to a first-century rabbi in many, but not all ways. Eyewitnesses also had their authority in their tradition, their oral recounting of events, and this tradition was then written down. Overall, the amount of variation in the Jesus tradition is not an accident. It was within the limits of the values of the community, and the evangelists felt free to rearrange the order of events to suit their points. All of the apostles also used texts as repositories of truths to back what they had already spoken in person or what the community had already learned. Orality was primary. As long as texts, oral or written, reliably represented the meaning, variance in wording were of no consequence. But to say that the Bible is full of errors just because there might be variance in readings is to read it anachronistically. Copyists in the ancient times focused on copying as was best for their audience and for the essential meanings. Preserving the exact wording was not necessary and did not invalidate truth to New Testament authors, because they even quoted from variant biblical manuscripts. In part 3, Walton and Sandy discuss the biblical world of biblical genres. They start with narrative, and they say that we cannot deny that which the text affirms as real, but we have to follow the logic of the author's conventions and values. In terms of biblical legal material, it carries authority in that it is a revelation of God's holiness. The laws give illustrations of some of the forms that holiness could take, and it's considered to represent that which is ideal or theoretical. In terms of prophecy, prophets' messages had meaning and significance for their contemporary audience, and that's what carried authority. The authors then go into how the New Testament writers used the written word of the prophets, and unfortunately, I can not get into that now, but I would highly recommend you to read this section. In part 4, Walton and Sandy make some concluding affirmations on the origin and authority of Scripture. They suggest that God empowered representatives to pass His spoken word to a wider audience. But we have to be careful to distinguish our interpretation, and the text. The picture of God or revelation is at the core of biblical authority, and our interpretations are just trying to get at that core reality. Only that which the authors intended to convey is authoritative, though there might be many true things in the Scriptures. Inerrancy may be a valid description of the truth of Scripture when it is clear that the criteria for this truth is ancient and not modern. Like the other books in the Lost World series, Walton's claims herein have been seriously scrutinized. Some scholars wonder whether the arguments being presented based on ancient culture were the only way in which the available evidence could be understood. They also think that he stresses too much of a reliance on oral texts in ancient culture, and it goes beyond warrant. If you desire to be an ethical, competent, and virtuous reader and interpreter of Scripture, be sure to read this book, even if you don't agree with everything that Walton and Sandy suggest. So continue on in your quest for truth, and be sure to watch the last video in the Lost World series on the lost world of the Torah, law as covenant and wisdom in ancient context.